Hello. My name's Jeremy Houck, and I'd like to thank you for making the choice to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. For a moment, I want you to imagine that we're going to take a trip from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, California. Now, we're not going to fly. We're not going to drive a car or take a bus. We have no intention of taking a train. What we want to do is actually go and to see the countryside. So we're going to walk the 2,829 miles. And if we walk 15 miles a day, it'll take us 189 days to complete the journey. Now, I imagine that immediately some of you are thinking, there's no way. It would be impossible for me to make that trip. And while I'm sure there's some beautiful sights out there, there's no way that I can do that. I don't really even want to do that. I mean, I have responsibilities. I have a job. I have kids. I have grandkids. It's too long for me to be away from my pets or my favorite restaurant or miss my favorite TV show. What if I told you that I'm going to make sure that while we're on this journey, you have everything that you need? I'm going to make sure that you get a year's salary. I'm going to provide all of your food and all of the supplies that you need for the trip. You're going to get new walking shoes anytime that you want them. Every night, we're going to put you up in a five-star hotel with a big, comfy bed. And every evening, you're going to have an appointment with a massage therapist who's going to take care of your sore muscles. We're going to have support vehicles following us along the way, and everything's going to be taken care of. Maybe now the trip sounds a little more plausible, but it's still going to be difficult. I'm asking you to do an awful lot of walking that's going to strain your muscles and your joints, but with the provided resources, perhaps it's a trip that we can make. What if I sweeten the pot a little more? What if I told you that once we get to San Francisco, you're going to get a $10 million reward in your own signature walking shoe? Would you consider taking the trip now? Did the trip that sounded so ridiculous a few seconds ago now sound a little more reasonable? I've discovered in my life that my ability to take on difficult tasks is often made easier when I'm provided with the appropriate resources. And often I weigh those difficult tasks against the reward of accomplishing those tasks. As God's people, we've been given a number of difficult tasks that may seem overwhelming and nearly unachievable. Yet, without exception, we find that along with the command, God also provides us the necessary resources and promises us abundant rewards to motivate us. Today, we're going to get to our last look at the life of Joseph, and we're going to discover that he's going to do something that many of us would find impossible. Last week, we left Joseph in the king's jail. Over the next two chapters, 11 years pass, and a lot of things happen. Joseph interprets the dream of the king's cupbearer, telling him that he's going to be restored to his work in the palace. After interpreting the dream, Joseph asks the cupbearer to remember him when he gets back into Pharaoh's service. But that doesn't immediately happen. We're told that the cupbearer forgets about Joseph. So after 2 years of sitting and rotting in the king's prison, Pharaoh has two dreams in the same night that are vivid and they trouble him. Nobody can interpret these dreams, not the king, not his advisors, not the magicians, not the wise men of Egypt. And it's at that moment that the cupbearer remembers his promise and tells the king about Joseph. Joseph is taken out of the prison, allowed to shave and wash and clean up, and he's brought before the king. Joseph informs the king that God gave him these two dreams and that God will give the interpretation through Joseph, through himself. The dreams are a sign that Egypt is going to experience 7 years of prosperity, 7 years of plenty, but they're going to be followed by 7 years of famine. And the famine is going to be so catastrophic that the country will be devastated. Joseph suggests that Pharaoh looks for someone who's wise and experienced and put him in charge of the country to collect food during the 7 years of plenty so that they will have food during the 7 years of famine, so that the people don't starve to death. Pharaoh thought that that was a great idea, and he immediately appoints Joseph over the entire land of Egypt. And so for the next 7 years, Joseph collects and he stores grains. And when the famine happens, we read that people from all around came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe throughout the world. When Jacob heard that grain was available in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why are you standing around looking at one another? I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy enough grain to keep us alive. Otherwise, we'll die." Now, I want you to understand what's happening because this is where I'm about to disagree with an awful lot of folks who want to paint Joseph as this perfect man, a man who doesn't have the same struggles and temptations that we deal with. Remember, we're looking at people who are righteous and broken. People who are loved by God, not because they're good people, but folks who strive to do the difficult work of being good once they realize the depth of the love that God has for them. Joseph finds himself in a powerful position, a position of authority. He's second only to Pharaoh in all of Egypt. We read that the famine is affecting Egypt, and it's also devastating other parts of the world, including Canaan. So while Joseph doesn't have any power in Canaan, his brothers show up in Egypt. We read in verse 2 that Joseph recognized his brothers instantly, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where are you from?" he demanded. At this moment, Joseph has all of the power, all of the riches, all of the authority he could ever want. But he has a history. The last 20 years haven't been kind to him. Over the last 20 years, his brothers threw him in a pit and planned to kill him. Instead, they make the decision to make a little money off of him. They sold him as a slave. Over the last 20 years, he was led through the desert to Egypt with chains around his wrists, shackles on his feet, an iron ring around his neck. Over the last 20 years, Potiphar's wife lied about him, accused him of trying to rape her, which causes him to be thrown into the king's prison. The king's cupbearer forgot about his promise and left Joseph in prison for another 2 years. And so now those very same men, his brothers, who started all of this pain and this whole ordeal, the ones that tried to destroy his dreams, are standing there in front of Joseph. And because Joseph is a sinful, broken human, just like you and me, his anger begins to seep out. He recognizes them and his blood begins to boil. The Bible says that he spoke harshly to them. He accuses them of being spies coming into the land to see where Egypt might be vulnerable to an attack. I've had some well meaning people in my life hold Joseph up as this beautiful model of forgiveness. They told me that Joseph's forgiveness was immediate and complete, but is that what you read happening in the text? Joseph doesn't see his brothers and immediately reveal who he was, hug their necks, tells them how much he loves them, and is so thankful to be reunited with them. Actually, Joseph is having the same struggles that we often have when it comes to forgiveness. Honestly, forgiveness is difficult. When I hear God's command to forgive, often you might as well tell me that I got to walk from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. When I've been deeply hurt and I think about the command to forgive, I want to argue. You don't know what they did to me. They lied about me over and over again. They intended to destroy my family, destroy my career. Do you know what they did to my wife and kids? You have no idea. You can't even imagine what I've been through. If you knew what this person had done to my family, you wouldn't say that I need to forgive them. They need to suffer, just like they made me suffer. I will never, ever forgive these people. The truth is, forgiving others is an extremely difficult thing for us to do. The greater the hurt, the more difficult the call to forgiveness is. I mean, how do you forgive somebody that destroyed the dreams that you had for your life? So when we read that Joseph spoke harshly to his brothers, it's one of those passages, if we can be completely honest, each and every one of us understand. We're often bent on revenge. We're drawn to this idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. To forgive the people that hurt us, the people that tried to destroy our dreams, is difficult and it's painful. But God is not just asking us to do the impossible. He has provided us everything that we need to do the things we consider impossible. God makes sure that we have the time, the space, and the grace to do what we will never be able to do on our own. That's what we discover in the story of Joseph. Because Joseph's brothers are about to say something that's going to begin to soften his heart. We read in verse 13, "Sir," they said, "there are actually 12 of us. We, your servants, are all brothers, son of a man living in the land of Canaan. Our youngest brother is back there with our father right now, and one of our brothers is no longer with us." The boys mentioned Jacob and Benjamin. It was never part of the plan for them to mention their dad and their little brother. In chapter 43, Jacob's distraught. He asks them, "What were you thinking? Why are you so cruel to me? Why did you tell them that you had another brother? You're taking everything that I've got." Yet for some reason that only God understood at the time, they were drawn to mention the two people that Joseph longed to see. At that moment, Joseph's desire to know about his dad, to know about his little brother, was greater than his need for revenge. You see, God's providing Joseph the time and the space that he needed to fulfill this difficult command. So Joseph comes up with this plan. He tells the boys that he will sell them the grain that they need, but he's going to keep one of them as a prisoner. Now, if they'll come back and bring Benjamin with them, Joseph will release the prisoner. And since the famine is going to last for a while, he will give them the ability to come and go freely to buy whatever they need. So Simon is taken as a prisoner, and the boys get their bags of grain and head home. But along the way, they discover that the money that they use to pay for the grain is in the bags of grain. And they immediately get afraid. They believe that God's punishing them for what they had done to Joseph 20 years ago. But God's writing this story to bring about the reconciliation that we all believe is impossible. So fast forward, and after some time, the famine's getting worse, and Jacob understands that they are desperate. They need to go back to Egypt and get more food, or their family's going to die of starvation. And the desperation is so great that he agrees to allow the boys to take Benjamin with him. Jumping ahead to Genesis 43, verse 15, we read, "So the men packed Jacob's gifts and double the money and headed off with Benjamin. They finally arrived in Egypt and presented themselves to Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the manager of his household, 'These men will eat with me at noon. Take them inside the palace. Then go slaughter an animal and prepare a big feast.'" Joseph noticed his brothers had finally returned. Now, we have no idea how long they left Simeon in the prison, but it had been long enough for Jacob to grow hungry and desperate enough to send Benjamin along with the other boys. Joseph wants to see Benjamin, to spend a little time with his little brother, so he has all of the brothers taken to his home. But the brothers are terrified, remember? They have no idea what's about to happen to them. So as soon as they enter the house, they immediately approach the manager and they confess that on their way home, they found the silver that they paid for the grain last time in their bags. But instead of being treated like criminals, they're showed kindness. They're reassured that the price of the grain was paid in full. They're given water to refresh themselves. Simeon is released from jail and allowed to join his brothers. They immediately spread out all of the gifts that they brought from their homeland, and they wait for Joseph to show up. As soon as Joseph enters the house, they bow down on the ground. They offer him all of these gifts from his homeland, his childhood home. And once again, something happens in Joseph. Something he can't manufacture in himself, something that only comes from the hand of God. Joseph receives these gifts, And I'm sure that the smell of the spices and the perfume, the sight of the pistachios and the honey brought him back to his dad's house all of those years ago. For the first time in 20 years, Joseph sees his little brother. The last time that Joseph saw Benjamin, he was a year old, and now he's a 21-year-old man. We read that Joseph is brought to tears. And actually, the Bible tells us that three different times in his interactions with his brothers, Joseph is not able to control himself. He breaks down in tears and he cries. I'm not inclined to believe that those are tears of joy. If Joseph is crying because he's already forgiven his brothers in his heart and wanted to make amends with them, he's in the position, he has the power and the authority to do that. The very first time they showed up in Egypt, no. Joseph is brought to tears because he's still in pain from the things that his brothers did to him. The hurt was deep. And when we hurt deeply, we're tempted to hurt other people deeply. But God is softening his heart. There are times when it causes us just as much pain to forgive as we first felt when we were offended. So maybe instead of punishing his brothers, there's a better plan. Maybe he'll come up with an idea to make sure his little brother has to live in Egypt with him while the other brothers go back home and starve. So Joseph tells the steward, fill their bags with all the food they can carry. Once again, put their money back in their bags, but this time, take my silver cup and hide it in the bag of the youngest. And then after they leave the city, I want you to chase them down and I want you to arrest the youngest for stealing my cup and bring him back to Egypt. And that's exactly what happened. But maybe the plan doesn't go exactly the way Joseph thought it would. You see, when the brothers saw the cup was found in Benjamin's sack, they tore their clothing in despair. Then they loaded their donkeys again and returned to the city. Joseph was still in the palace when Judah and his brothers arrived, and they fell to the ground before him. The brothers are not about to allow Benjamin to be taken as a slave to Egypt in the same way they allowed Joseph to be taken away from his home 20 years ago. They all returned to Egypt together, and they say that they're all guilty of the crime, and they will all stay together in Egypt as slaves. And Joseph says, no, I only require that the youngest will remain as a slave. The rest of you go back to your father. But Judah speaks up and he pleads with Joseph. He says, allow me to remain and serve as a slave in Benjamin's place. And I believe that this is the singular moment that everything else changes. This is the moment when grace touches sin and forgiveness becomes possible. You see, the same Judah that 20 years ago stood over the pit that Joseph was in, eating lunch and talking his brothers into selling Joseph as a slave, that same man is now offering to take his brother's place. The same Judah 20 years ago who didn't care less or couldn't have cared less about what his father thought about the death of Joseph is now so concerned about his father, he's willing to give up his freedom. This is the moment that makes Joseph's decision to do the difficult work of forgiveness. Let me remind you, forgiveness is always a choice. Oftentimes, it must be divorced from the way that we feel. I mean, how many times have you and I withheld forgiveness because we didn't feel like forgiving? I like this quote that I found. Forgiveness is a promise, not a feeling. When you forgive other people, you're making a promise not to use their past against them. Forgiveness is the choice to let go of hurt. Our desire for revenge, that didn't mean that we're going to immediately feel better or the relationship will ever be completely restored. What it means is that I have made the decision to let go of the pain. And over time, I realize that my emotions will quiet down. You may have to make that choice to forgive more than once. You may have to remind yourself you've already chosen to forgive when you're tempted to remember the hurt that you felt. But forgiveness starts in your mind. You make the choice, and your feelings will eventually follow. As we get ready to make our way to the tables today, I want to remind you of something that I've shared before. Lewis Smedes was a pioneer in forgiveness research, and he wrote that there are three levels of forgiveness. First, we must rediscover the humanity of the person who hurt us. When we're considering doing the difficult work of forgiveness, we got to come to grips with the fact that the other person that hurt us, they're a broken, sinful person, just like I am. When Judah spoke to Joseph, he talks about their dad. He talks about the pain that his dad felt when he believed that Joseph had died. He talks about the pain that all of them would feel if they've got to go back and watch their dad die of depression and sorrow if Benjamin's not allowed to return with them. It's a very emotional speech. And it's a speech that caused Joseph to see them as hurt, broken people, people Joseph could relate to. Secondly, we surrender our right to get even. God allows Joseph the time and the space to allow his heart to soften towards his brothers. At first, he wants them to pay for all the pain that they caused him. But every time they met, every conversation, Joseph begins to surrender his right to use his power and authority to get even. As Joseph begins to see his brothers as people and not the objects of his pain, he begins to understand that he's never going to get even with them. Only thing that he can accomplish right now is causing his brothers pain and suffering, causing his father, his brothers' wives, and their children pain and suffering. They're all going to be caught in the backwash of his revenge plot. When Joseph considers all of the collateral damage that his actions will cause, he begins to surrender his right to get even. And finally, we must revise our feelings towards the other person, which means giving up our hatred and letting go of our bitterness. Ultimately, it means taking Jesus seriously when he said, "Love your enemies, bless those that curse you, and do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you." Forgiveness is not like flipping on a light switch. There are some offenses that can be forgiven quite quickly, but other offenses take time. And God has promised to give us all of the tools and the resources that we need to do the difficult work of forgiveness. There may be times when the weight of forgiving others feels like taking a journey where we have to walk from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. But God is with us every step of that journey, and He's already providing us all of the tools that we need to do His will. Truly being able to forgive without God is impossible. That's why Dr. Smedes calls forgiveness a miracle. Forgiveness is nothing less than a miracle of God. And when we put forth the effort to practice the grace of forgiveness, God says that in turn, we will find the grace to be forgiven. And that's a whole lot better than $10 million in your own signature shoe. God's beautiful offer of forgiveness is why we gather at the table, and it's why we celebrate together today. And so it's my hope and my prayer that today, as you go to the table and you take the bread and you take the cup, you are reminded of your own desperate need of forgiveness. And as you remember what God has already done for you, hopefully, it will cause you to begin to think about how you need to extend the same grace that you have received to others. Forgiveness is a difficult journey. But God doesn't expect you to make that journey alone. He gives you all of the tools, all of the time, all of the space, all of the grace that you need to practice the beautiful ministry of forgiveness. I hope that you have a wonderful time around the table. Never forget how deeply you're loved. And I look forward to seeing you very soon.